Good morning everyone. Guys, I thought I'd get this video out to you guys before you all go out for your Sunday dinners and your Sunday lunches wherever you go. So what I want to talk about today, guys, is the devastating effects of the vulnerabilities to our food supply. Excuse me. So I did a video a couple of days ago and I talked about my top 10 civilian targets, soft targets, not asymmetric, but we'll come on to that afterwards. Basically my top 10 vulnerabilities in the UK that could be attacked by criminal gangs, and it would have devastating effects if you live in the UK. So if you've not seen that video, go and look now, guys, alright? And if you've not done so already, give me a like and a follow and a subscribe, whatever it is you do with the buttons below. To be honest, I don't really know. Really helps us out when you do that, and it's just a little press for your fingers, guys. Anyway, so in that video I did, if you've not seen it, go and look at it now. I talked about food, and that was my number three risk. Water was 2 and cyber was number 1. It seems that every time I do a video, a couple of days later, something relating to that video happens. So I'm hoping that's not the case here. But I wanted to do a little bit more of a talk about the food supply in general, and how ridiculously vulnerable it is in the UK, and it's vulnerable to these criminal gangs. So what do we mean then by food supply? Well, we've got various stages in our food supply in the UK, and let's not forget the food supply the amount of food we produce in the UK is getting less and less, and that's because of bureaucracy. I think that everybody should be growing their own stuff in their own gardens, and we should have interdependent communities where we don't, we can grow a big monocrop of potatoes, tomatoes, whatever, and then you just trade that with your neighbours or whatever. But anyway, guys, I should probably do that as a different video. But the vulnerabilities in our food supply, the main key areas that I kind of, look at are the fields. So basically where the food's being grown, and that also doubles up with cattle and livestock that are grazing in those fields, so basically the fields that these things are being produced in, obviously food that's growing, and cattle and livestock. Excuse me. The farms, so the farms themselves, where where some of the livestock's kept in bad weather, where the food's brought, when things are being processed before they're sent to the processing plants, when they're in their raw format and they're all concentrated. We've got the processing plants themselves, so once the farmers, got all his wheat, it's in location, then they take it somewhere else to be processed. You've got the transport of that, so the farmer may use an outside contractor, they may use a haulage company, and then we've got imports. We import a lot of food, and then obviously the food that we're importing, obviously that comes under the same threats while they're in the host country: fields, farms, processing, transport. But then you have the bonus, well, I say bonus, then you have the added risk of, while it's being transported internationally, how do we know what's happened to that food? How do we know if it's been contaminated or not? Where are the checks? Where are the balances? Where are these things done? So you see, there's lots of vulnerabilities and there's lots of chinks. And I'd say there's lots of chinks in the armour, but there isn't really any armour. There isn't any, in fact, there isn't any armour in this food supply. We've kind of, in the UK and in the world, I guess, you kind of don't expect people to poison their own food supply because they'll be eating it too. But that's the reality of the way we're moving forwards now, guys, and it's going to be called something called soft war. Nobody's talking about this. Nobody gives it much thought in the media. The reality is people want to talk about guns and tanks and bombs, and you know what, guys, that gets you headlines. But the reality is soft war is going to take more casualty. Well, I don't want to be alarmist. There'll be more people going sick and potentially dying, I feel, in the UK from soft war rather than missiles coming over and hitting us. But the problem with soft war is it can be done by any of these criminal gangs. You're not going to send your best spy with his tuxedo and his fancy watch and his Aston Martin, to contaminate some food. Why would you? Why would you risk all that training, all that expertise, all that knowledge, all that support system that they've got to have Well, you can just go and pay some criminal gang to go and do it. And the reality is the criminal gang themselves, they won't even know that they're committing state-sponsored sabotage, because they'll be told, hey guys, listen, you know, my uncle or my aunt or someone, you know, they had a problem with this farmer. Can you just go and pour this in his, you know, in that container there? And that's it. You pay them, you know, and it's done. So that's the reality of soft war, guys. As we move forward, we're going to see soft war targets being attacked in the UK. So E. coli then, what is it? You know, what do we mean by E. coli? Well, I'm gonna kind of talk about E. coli now, but there can be a whole host of contaminants in our food supply. There can be a whole host of ways that our food supply is contaminated. But you know, E. coli is in the news at the moment. People are talking about E. coli, so I thought I'd talk about E. coli. But remember, you know, it's not isolated to E. coli. So basically, E. coli, it's a bacteria. It's a bacteria infection. You get it from eating eating contaminated food, which is, you know, basically undercooked food, because, you know, cooking food will kill the E. coli, but if you undercook it, don't cook it enough, obviously, then the E. coli is not going to have time, you know, it's not going to die. This is usually from minced beef or minced stuff, because if you think about a steak, you know, the E. coli can only get on the top of it, on the pan bearing surfaces. Once you cook that, you kill it straight away, and it's not going into the meat. With the beef and the mince, it's all minced up, so that E. coli now is inside the beef. So it's a lot harder to get the inside of that beef at the right temperature to kill it. So that's the reality, guys. Okay, with the you know, with the meat and the beef and all that sort of stuff. Also, it comes from unwashed vegetables. If your vegetables are being washed in contaminated water, or you're washing, you know, you've got a bowl and then you wash vegetables and something's been in there before and that's contaminated, and everything else you put in there is contaminated. So you've got a big dish of, I don't know, cold water. If you put your, I don't know, let's think of a vegetable, your tomatoes in there that are contaminated, you wash your tomatoes and put them on the side. Then you wash your cucumbers, then you wash your onions, then everything becomes contaminated. You see what I mean, guys, alright? So it's really important to, you know, just take ownership over where your food and stuff. Also, drinking unpasteurized drinks. So basically your unprocessed drinks, like your orange juices and stuff, you know, your fresh orange juice, or, you know, these smoothies that are putting fresh vegetables in there. Contaminated water, you know, look what's happening in the UK at the moment. I talk about this all the time, about the water supply and the vulnerabilities of our water supply. I've been talking about this for almost a year now. You know, the reality is our water companies do not put sufficient investment back into the infrastructure, and why would they? They don't get a return on that investment. And the reality is, you know, the water supply in the UK is ridiculously vulnerable as it is, but it's also vulnerable now, you know, because of these soft war effects. Touching contaminated surfaces as well, guys, alright? So if you work in a kitchen, you know, a toilet, if you go to a farm, all these sort of stuff, if you touch this and then you ingest that somehow, then you're going to be contaminated. So there's lots of ways, you know, and I'm sure there's others, you know, there's lots of ways you can be contaminated by E. coli. So going back then now, guys, to what we said, these vulnerabilities, so fields, farms, processing, transports and imports. Can you see now how vulnerable this system is? How vulnerable it is to criminal gangs. Now, if you're a state-sponsored aggressor, and look at, then guys, I'm not saying anybody's a state-sponsored, for this video, I'm not pointing the finger at anyone. All I'm saying is, Russia have said that the West are now enemies. So, you know, you can kind of see that. The UK has been supplying weapons to the Ukrainians to fight the Russians. So the UK, you know, I don't think, you know what, I'm going to go out with it. The UK is an adversary at least of Russia. So for the Russian side of it then, if they can pay a few £1,000s to a criminal gang to do whatever, it makes no sense for them not to do that. Remember, Russia's a huge country. They've got a lot of money that they can spend. So, you know, the food supply is very vulnerable, you know, to criminal gangs because they're cheap. you know, you can pay, by cheap I mean, think how much it would cost to send a team over, a team of Russian special forces. You know, how much it's going to cost them to get from point A to point B, the support structure that's going to go into that, you know, and the risk involved. Whereas you can just pay a criminal gang and you'll probably get the same results for the price of the flights. Yeah, so criminal gangs, they're cheap, they're disposable. I don't mean, you know, they're going to end up in a river somewhere. I mean, once you've used that criminal gang or that network of criminal gangs, you don't have to use them again. That's it, that's done. It's a one-time job. These guys will hardly ever know that they're working for a state sponsor. And the reality is, we will probably never know in the UK that they're working for a state sponsor. All we'll see is on the media an increase in, you know, E. coli, an increase in water problems, an increase in things that we've never had before. Of course, at the high ends of government, they'll know what's happening. At GCHQ, they'll know what's happening. But, you know, on the ground, it's very difficult to pinpoint who's actually doing this and then to trace that back through the chain. And of course, you know, with them being disposable, they're non-attributable. Like what we said earlier, the people who are probably several levels up, they won't know where this money's coming from. You know, there'll be a Russian handler, probably, somewhere in the UK, who will be then paying somebody else to pay somebody else to pay somebody else to pay somebody else. And that'll all be cash. It will never be traced back to these people. And this is just, you know, it's just a new phase of war. Nobody's talking about it yet in the UK, but we will, I think, as we certainly, when we hit September. So the phases of war, really, as I see off the top of my head, are green war, which would be huge, full military invasions. You've got logistics supplies, you've got air support, you've got basically your full military deployment. You've got black wars, which would be predominantly special forces operating in small groups, striking and seizing high value targets. You've got asymmetric war, which would be when a small force can't take on a big force, so they have to do things like ambushes, roadside bombs, you know, just harassing fire, basically. Well, not harassing fire. Basically, they have to take them on in a non-conventional way, which, yeah, highlights that, guys, okay? So ambushes, roadside bombs, small attacks, dressed in civilian clothing, very hard to combat. Some people call that counterinsurgency or an insurgency. Doesn't matter what you call it, guys, it's the same thing. And then we've got soft war, which is what I'm talking about now. So you've got, you know, obviously my top 10 civilian targets. You've got things like water, food supply, gas, electric, emergency services, all these things that are ridiculously vulnerable. So when we think about that, guys, okay, would it be difficult for a criminal gang to get a hold of, and again, I'm just going to use the E. coli as an example. Would it be difficult for the criminal gangs to get a hold of a bottle of concentrated E. coli and pour it in some sort of, you know, processing plant, some sort of transportation, some sort of area that's got a large concentration of food? Yes, of course it would. It would be ridiculously easy. Tell me, wherever you live in the UK or in the United States or in Canada or wherever, can you walk up to where the fields are that are growing food? Can you walk up to them? Is there any security to stop you going in? Yes, of course you can. Can you walk into the fields where there's livestock? Yes, of course you can. Can you walk into the farms? Yes, of course you can. The processing plants, the transportation, these are all things that are ridiculously vulnerable. So the next question, could there be a chemist in the UK or anywhere, you know, in the world that has the capacity to cultivate or grow, you know, a large concentration of E. coli and then put it in a water bottle? Absolutely, guys, okay? It's not a difficult thing to do. A competent chemist can do this, no problem at all. So, you know, we've seen the vulnerabilities there, guys, in the, you know, in the food supply. So what can we do to make sure that we don't get E. coli or any other of these diseases? First of all, make sure your food's cooked thoroughly. This, you know, for me, when I think of E. coli, I always think of burgers. Just the way they're made, you know, you get a load of beef, then the beef could have, think of what we spoke about. If the contamination of the beef's on the outside, once you mince that up, you don't know where it is. It's all in that mince now. So you have to cook that, you really have to cook that through. And you know, you get a nice thick juicy burger. Guys, I love a thick juicy burger. It's very difficult to cook that through and to get all that cooked. So we have to take, you know, we have to take responsibility for what we're eating. Wash food with clean water. Remember the example I gave earlier. If you wash it, you know, if you're washing, if you're washing in water that's contaminated, you might not know it's contaminated because it might be clean water, and the first thing you put in is contaminated, which has contaminated all that water. So you see where I'm going with that? Guys, the reality is, you know, we need to take ownership over what we consume. And, you know, I see it all the time, people going to these restaurants and fast food places, and do we know what we're eating? Do we have any idea of what these people behind the counter are putting in our food? And I'm not meaning to be alarmist there, guys. I'm just saying that's the reality of the situation. And as we're moving forwards into this new phase of soft war, which is obviously, you know, going to be a complement of green, black, asymmetric, which can be non-conventional, insurgency. We're going to have this new phase of war called soft war. And I feel that this soft war is going to be more devastating than, you know, certainly than green war if you live in the UK, because I don't think, you know, people are always worried about, you know, big missiles coming over and hitting the UK. That may happen, guys, all right? I'm not, but right now, from the information I've got, the main threat, if you're in the UK, is from soft war. Maybe a little bit of black war, what we've seen with, I mean, the perfect example is the, in Salisbury, the Schiphol poisoning. Now, whether you believe that or not, it doesn't matter, but the reality is the perception that that happened is there. So where you've got the two Russians, you know, coming out, doing the poisoning, then, you know, leaving the UK before anybody knew what was happening. You know, that is Russian special forces, best Russian guys with their tuxedos and fancy watches. That is one of those jobs. That was, you know, so that could still happen in the UK. But the reality is that's only going to affect a tiny amount of people. And that tiny amount of people that's going to affect it, they're going to be high value personnel. They're going to be people of interest to the enemy. That's not going to affect them, you know, the belt and buckle of the UK. What is going to affect the belt and buckle of the UK is these soft war incidents, guys, okay? Food, water, electricity, all this sort of stuff. And as we move forwards and as we start going into, you know, and as the UK starts supplying more weapons into Ukraine, starts looking at other avenues of war. Let's not forget that the Israel-Gaza conflict, that hit a new phase today. I should probably do a video about that later on today, but soft war today, guys, okay? Yeah, so that's the reality. As we move forwards and there's more weapons being sent to country X, country Y, Russia's sending weapons to these guys and they're sending weapons to these guys. It makes absolutely no sense for these countries not to invest, not to pay criminal gangs to conduct soft war. You get a lot of bang for your buck if you want to use that way, and it's very hard to trace back. It's very hard to combat because criminal gangs by nature are criminal. They don't follow laws. So once you pay them, you know, something gets done. So the reality is, guys, okay, we need to take ownership over what we consume, whether that's food, water, absolutely anything, all right? And that is my talk about the soft war, the food supply, and E. coli. Remember, guys, okay, I focused on E. coli now because it's out there, it's in the news, people are talking about it, you know, everybody's interested. The reality is there's so many bacteria, there's so many viruses that people could put into the, you know, into the food supply, into the water supply, all these sort of things that, you know, it could be absolutely anything, guys, okay? So you just need to take, we all need to take ownership over what we consume, and that's it for me, guys. I'm going to mag to grid, and I'll be seeing you guys later.